Hi, everybody. This is Sue Altman, and I am going to be talking today about the Dutch Golden Age. This is a lecture that is available through Livingston Library and can be accessed on their YouTube channel. So let's get started. And we're going to be talking today about a really significant and beautiful time in the history of art. So I'm going to start with the slides here. So let's first talk about what makes the Dutch Golden Age such an important time in art history. The fact is that this was a time of great prosperity in the Dutch Republic. They had just completed the 80 Years' War with Spain, won their independence from Spain, and there was a lot of money being made. There was trade all over the world through the East and the West Indies companies that were importing and exporting goods all over the world at this time. It was also a time of advancements in the financial sector. The central banking system, the stock exchange started during this period. Amsterdam was the wealthiest city in Europe, and they had very high literacy rates compared to the rest of Europe, and this definitely benefited the artists that were living during this time. So it was, this is just an example of the war between the Dutch and the Spanish. And here is the Spanish army. This was a Velázquez painting showing sort of the other side, the Spanish as victors in an earlier age. This is a map of the different provinces of the Dutch Republic, and we'll see that show up in several paintings, particularly by Vermeer. That may look familiar to you from that. It was a sign of pride in their nation at this time. So to really understand what made the Dutch Republic different from times that came before, it's really a matter of patronage. In previous eras and in other parts of the world, parts of Europe, the aristocracy, royalty, and the church were the main patrons of art. Now, as you know, there was the Protestant Reformation in the 16th century, which led to the lack of influence of the Catholic Church in this part of Europe. So there was a movement away from religious art almost completely. The churches were very simply decorated, the Protestant churches, and that type of art was destroyed quite a bit and was certainly not being newly commissioned. There was also no royalty to commission art. The Republic was an actual republic. There were not any real central leadership. A lot of the areas, the provinces of Holland, were ruled separately like city-states. So that was another form of patronage that was gone. So what took its place? It was actually patronage from the ordinary people, the merchant class, the newly wealthy, or even middle class, to whatever extent that was at this time, that would be commissioning art. So it's estimated that over 5 million paintings were created during the 100 years of the Dutch Golden Age. Only about 1% of these survive to this day. It's pretty remarkable. So let's talk about some of the previous influences that affected this art. This is a northern tradition. So this is a Flemish painter, Jan van Eyck, who created some of the first oil paintings, and oil paint became the primary medium at this time. In the south of Europe, they were still doing a lot of tempera painting, a lot of painting like the Sistine chapel ceiling, which was a fresco. So that was still a water-based paint that was applied into wet plaster. Now, when you get to oil paint, you're getting a lot more time to work on a painting, using small brushes and layers and glazes and creating these incredible effects of different surfaces. You notice the metal and the mirrored surfaces, the different fabrics and glass, and all of that becomes a very important part of art in this part of the world. And you see that again in this beautiful altarpiece by Robert Campin, also 15th century Flemish. This, by the way, is in the cloisters, so it can be visited fairly close to home. Bruegel, another very important painter of the North, and he was one of the first painters to concentrate on what we call now genre painting, and this is a scene of ordinary people. So no kings, no queens, no religious figures, just everyday people doing normal activities. And this was done, as you see, in the 16th century. And Caravaggio, an Italian artist of the Baroque era, a little bit earlier than a lot of the artists we'll be talking about today, and in Italy. So the subject matter was different. There was a lot more religious painting in his work, but his revolutionary use of the effects of light was really important to a lot of artists that were going to follow him, and we'll see that. So let's just take a quick look at some of the centers of art. We have Amsterdam. A lot of Rembrandt's works were made there. Hals worked in Haarlem. Rembrandt was from the town of Leiden. As I said, he also worked in Amsterdam. And Vermeer, of course, is based in Delft, and this is his view of the town of Delft. And another view of Delft by Vermeer, you know, showing a few figures, and if you notice what they're doing is scrubbing floors and sweeping, and these kind of activities were very popular to be shown in these paintings. The idea of cleanliness was really important to these people. So we're going to divide this into different types of painting because a lot of different things were done during this time. As I said, religious painting was on the decline, but it was still done to some extent. So again, there's Caravaggio. You see the heightened sense of drama, the movement, the very almost theatrical lighting that he's using. Of course, this is Italian, but here is a painter named Gerrit van Honthorst, and this is his Liberation of St. Peter, and you see very similar lighting effects. And he was considered one of the Dutch Caravaggisti, or followers of Caravaggio. So the influence is very obvious here. Rembrandt also is using those extreme lighting effects, like directed light toward the center of action. This is Simeon's Song of Praise, who saw the young Christ child. And you see Mary and Joseph on the ground here. It's said that Rembrandt kind of goes a step further than Caravaggio, whereas instead of the light being directed at the objects, it almost seems as if the light is emanating from them, like glowing from these people in his paintings. And this is another example, beautiful example of Rembrandt and his biblical painting of the story of Bathsheba, spied by King David. And here she's has her feet being cleaned by a maidservant, holding the letter in her hand, but especially notice the expression on her face. Rembrandt's really considered a master of psychological acuity in his depiction of people, especially in his portraits, but also in these historical and religious paintings. And there's another Rembrandt a biblical painting. This is one of the only mythological paintings done by Vermeer. It's a very early painting of his. Notice the composition. This is called a circular composition, and it keeps your eye moving around the canvas, and his use of color is helping with that as well. So let's move on to landscape, and that became very typical of Dutch art at this time. And we're going to look now, this is called Wooded Landscape by Habima. And you see very small figures, but the landscape itself is really the dominant subject of this painting. And this is something that's also fairly new, having landscape as the primary subject, and a lot of them don't have any people at all. Landscape was always considered kind of low on what they call the hierarchy of subject matter. Usually it was the religious, the historical and mythological paintings were at the top of that hierarchy. Portraits, especially of very important people, came below that, and landscape would be below that. At the very bottom would be still life. But that changes, as I said, during the Dutch Golden Age. This is a seascape. As you know, this region benefited from a very strong navy, strong exploration by ship, and that became a very common theme. Notice also the very low horizon. Of course, you're talking here about a very flat country, and it gives an opportunity for the artist to really make the most of the clouds and the atmospheric effects in the sky. And sometimes they would depict the sea as a sort of malevolent force, the dangers of the sea and the storms and things like that. This is Van Ruysdael, who was one of the leading landscape painters, and you can really see his attention that he's paying to the clouds here and the way it's affecting the light on the landscape. This is called Brazilian landscape, and again, this reflects the sort of global nature of the economy at this time. They were exploring all different parts of the world, which were considered kind of exotic at the time. They were previously not very well known. And this is the Haarlem Meer. This was an inland lake. Again, very low, flat horizon line here. And this is not terribly typical of landscape in the Dutch Golden Age. It sort of more reflects Flemish painting like Bruegel, showing people skating on the lake, and very obviously wintry landscape. And this is Van Ruysdael again, and his view of Haarlem with bleaching grounds. The water in this part of the world was very pure, and it was used to bleach out the fabrics that were then shipped to other parts of Europe. Again, beautiful treatment of the masses of clouds, and that's the old church of Haarlem in the background. And this is another Ruysdael, and it's the Jewish cemetery. So this one in particular is combining the idea of what they call memento mori, or reminders of death, with the landscape, making it sort of an allegory. And that theme of memento mori, or vanitas, is something we'll revisit when we get to the still life paintings as well. So we're moving on now. We're moving quickly into portraiture, which was a very common theme. Again, it was not kings and queens that were being painted, but more everyday people. And it was a sign of status, of course, to have your portrait painted. There are a lot of self-portraits being done. This is Gerard Ter Borch and his self-portrait. And again, using those very simple backgrounds that you would have seen in Caravaggio to accentuate the face especially. And the black and white of the costumes also is very effective at sort of framing the facial features. And again, another Terborch. So this one I'm sure you're familiar with, one of Vermeer's most famous paintings. It's at the Maurits House in Holland, in The Hague actually. And this is a painting, it's been sometimes attributed, they say it has to do with Vermeer's daughter. It was not the same story as the book and movie that were popularized, that popularized this painting. But it's not really that important. What Vermeer is doing here is not a traditional portrait, commissioned portrait, but something called a trony, which was a type of portrait that was not of a specific person, but rather of a type of person, often accentuated by the use of costumes, hats, turbans, and of course, jewelry, as you see here. It's very unlikely that this was an actual pearl. It's quite huge. It would have been very, very expensive. It was probably a fake pearl. But it's one of the simpler paintings done by Vermeer, but quite beautiful. It's considered the Dutch Mona Lisa in a way, very well known. Here's another Vermeer study of a young woman. By the way, I do have some asterisks on a lot of these paintings, and what that indicates is that these are available to be seen at the Met, of course not right now, but supposedly this is an ongoing show. So when the Met does reopen, hopefully this will still be there. And the Met does have 5 Vermeers, which is pretty extraordinary. And the Frick has a couple also. And there's only about 35 existing in the world. So New York has a very significant share of that. So now let's move on to Frans Hals. He was a Harlem-based painter. This is his portrait of a very aristocratic young lady and her nurse. Notice the real contrast between the costumes. Looks very uncomfortable for a young child here, but also see how there's a sort of roughness to the depiction of the lower classes as opposed to the upper. What you see here is Hals' group portrait of a militia company in Harlem. And both he and Rembrandt were kind of pioneers in a new form of group portraiture. So instead of being very static with all the figures facing forward the same way, he's creating these very lively, dynamic scenes of groups of men. So these would have been portraits like sort of a guild and would have been hung in the guild hall. So this is the guild of the militia company, and various groups would commission these portraits. Each of the people would have been posed separately, and they actually paid for their participation in these paintings. And the ones who paid the most were featured most prominently. This one in particular, the figures are treated fairly evenly, but that's not true of all of them. This is one of Hals' most famous paintings called The Laughing Cavalier. It's not an actual depiction of someone laughing. He actually has just a slight smile on his face, a bit accentuated by the upturned mustache, very opulent clothing. But what you should really look for in Hals is this kind of pioneering painting technique where he was using very visible brush strokes. And you'll see that a little more clearly in some of the other paintings. This one is a good example. So very loose painterly style that was very influential for later painters going into the 19th and 20th century even. This is what's called a pendant portrait. It's a portrait of a man and his wife. They're in similar poses, opposite facing. And in the corners are their coat of arms. So these would have been very common as wedding gifts and would have been hung either next to each other or on facing walls. This is a portrait by Judith Lester. She was a very successful portrait painter in the day. There were several women that were successful during this period of time. She was a student of Hall's, and you see her very well dressed with a paintbrush in her hand and a palette in the other. Very common for women to portray themselves in the act of painting. They wanted to make sure they were getting credit for being the artist, because a lot of times that was taken away from them. Here's Rembrandt's anatomy lesson of Dr. Tulp. Another example of a guild portrait. Of course, this would have been the Surgeons Guild. And you see, it's very obvious who the main character is here. And he's performing a dissection on a cadaver. And these were done as sort of public events at that time. So sort of for the entertainment of the public in a way, but also as a lesson for the students who are very attentive as they look at both the cadaver. And if you notice in the shadows is this very large book, which would have been the anatomy book. And they were kind of comparing what they saw in front of them and what was in the book. So again, very important portrait, and this really kind of put Rembrandt on the map, and he became very successful after that. And this is Rembrandt's most famous, probably, group portrait. It's known as the Night Watch. It darkened quite a bit over the years, so it wasn't really as dark as seen originally. So there's a lot going on here. You have Captain Banning Coke in the center with the red sash and his lieutenant by his side. So even though they're fairly evenly painted and in size, you can definitely tell who the leader is here. He's taller, he's wearing the red. Also notice how his hand is reflected, the shadow of his hand on the figure next to him. There's this strange little girl in the background, kind of a sort of a mascot to this group. She's wearing a chicken hanging from her belt, which I've heard is sort of a pun on the name Coke of the leader, the captain here. Here's an early self-portrait. So we know Rembrandt is one of the masters of the self-portrait. He did them throughout his life. This may have actually been a copy by a student. They're not really sure. Gorget is the metal piece around his neck here. But it's so fascinating with Rembrandt because of so many portraits, I think over 40 or so throughout his life. You can see him aging and see various troubles he's going through in his life. He actually had quite a tragic life. All of his children predeceased him, as well as his beloved wife, who was in a lot of his paintings. He also ended up bankrupt and buried in a pauper's grave. This is a self-portrait from much later, of course, in Rembrandt's life. He was probably only in his 50s at this time. He looks quite a bit older. He's sitting in a chair in a pose very similar to the way a king would sit on a throne. And he's holding an implement that could look sort of like a king's scepter. It's actually a device that painters use to keep their brushes steady while they're painting. But again, notice the sensitivity with which he's painting the portrait itself. And this is called Portrait of an Elderly Man, one of his later works, probably a friend of Rembrandt. Notice the very loose and thick brush strokes he's using, and that happened later in his career. And the Jewish wedding, you know, which relates to biblical story, and really shows a lot of psychological connection between these figures. Oops, sorry. This is Rembrandt's Aristotle with a bust of Homer, quite dark. This is at the Frick as well. And it's Aristotle who's contemplating the bust, sort of thinking about whether he should put more emphasis on the material world, which is signified by the very thick chain he's wearing around his chest, and or the world of the mind, which would have been displayed by Aristotle. Here's another one of these tronies, a man in Oriental costume. He's really doing a lot with the sort of gold and rich fabrics that he's using here. Almost more emphasis on that than on the face itself. So let's move on to genre painting. So I mentioned that was something that was pioneered in a way by Bruegel in the 16th century, but really came to its pinnacle in the Dutch Golden Age. This is Peter de Hooch, and he was a very important painter, also based in Delft, similar to Vermeer. A man smoking and a woman drinking in a courtyard. So again, ordinary people, there's definitely a difference between the woman serving them and the child and the wealthier patrons. Notice the great detail of the bricks and the stones in the courtyard. There's also sometimes sort of a moralistic element to some of these paintings, showing the different kind of foibles of man, the different sort of sins, not with a really punitive take on it, but just almost humorous in a lot of ways, the kind of trouble people get into. This is called the linen cupboard. And you see this very explicitly described interior. Again, the difference between the maid and the woman of the household here. So ordinary events made really beautiful by the quality of the painting and the attention to detail. So here's Jan Steen, and as I mentioned before, a lot of these paintings have a humorous element, and this is called the dissolute household. So it's sort of making fun of these people. Steen had a very active household himself. And it's actually in Holland, a messy or disorganized house is known as a Jan Steen house. So you see the food on the floor, the cat, and you know, a woman stepping on a book, and people doing things like drinking and smoking and gossiping and being lazy and all these kind of things going on. This is called Curiosity. Has some beautiful depiction of the clothing, the satin here. And letter writing is a very common theme in many of these genre paintings. Here's the suitor's visit. Again, it looks like the same skirt here. And love was also a theme. When you see a lute, that's a symbol of love. Notice also the Oriental rug on the table here. That was a common feature in a prosperous household. The dog also is, whenever there's a story of marriage or courtship, you see a dog as a symbol of fidelity and loyalty. Another Steen painting, Feast of St. Nicholas. So this was not Christmas, it was Another feast around that time that was the occasion for presents. And you see all this chaos going on, children crying and grabbing toys and things breaking. And in the corner, you see a man with a baby pointing up to the chimney where St. Nicholas had come to deliver his presents. Here's another Steen. He's used parables often as a theme. So this one is "As the old sing, so pipe the young," basically talking about all the bad habits that the older generation passes on to the younger. This one, you could see the man teaching his son how to smoke. There's bagpipes, which were symbolic of eroticism. And this man here, this elderly man, is actually wearing this cap that was worn by a new father. So this is like a celebration of fatherhood here with a lot of sly kind of innuendo. So here's Vermeer. So he's a master of genre painting. This is called Maid Pouring Milk. Again, just this very simple moments in time, very quiet. It's almost as if we're voyeurs peeking through to see these events. Notice there's Delft tiles on the wall behind. You almost always see the light coming from this upper window in a Vermeer painting, and it illuminates all these different surfaces with these little dots of light. He probably was using optical instruments like a camera obscura, and there's a lot been written about that recently. This woman with a water pitcher. Again, you see the light coming from that side. Beautiful treatment of the translucency of the fabric here. And you see the map on the wall that we had seen earlier. And this little pitcher that is reflected reflecting the oriental rug into the side. This is called A Maid Asleep. So often the lower classes were shown kind of shirking their duties. Again, we're sort of voyeurs to the scene. They're not aware of our presence. A Woman with a Balance. This is one of my favorite Vermeers, this delicacy with the way she's holding the little balance to measure her jewels. Notice also behind her is a scene of the Last Judgment. And that relates to that use of the balance, the weighing of souls and things like that. This is Officer and Laughing Girl. And you see the map again. And there's a kind of an interesting disparity between the size of the figure in the foreground and who's mainly in silhouette, and the girl in the background. They're fairly close to each other, but the figure in the foreground appears much larger. This may have been a distortion, they think, because of that use of lenses that he is supposed to have used. There's a lot of evidence about that. There's a book called The Secret Knowledge by David Hockney that gives a lot of information about this. And another Vermeer, Young Woman with a Lute. As I mentioned before, the lute has always been a symbol of love. And musical instruments are very commonly shown in Vermeer's paintings. And this one is quite beautiful, Mistress and Maid, and the mistress is the maid is handing a letter to the woman, and she has this very kind of tentative expression on her face. Beautiful depiction of this yellow jacket with fur. Here's Jan Steen, Young Woman Eating Oysters. And you see the woman kind of looking very provocatively out toward us. Very realistic depiction of the still life here. And oysters, again, an erotic kind of connotation. You have another two people in the background. It's amazing the detail in this particular painting because the entire thing is about 5 by 8 inches. This is Franz Hals, young man and woman in an inn. Again, you see that looseness, the visible brushwork in this one. And this could be a couple. It could also be a prostitute and her job. This is called A Visit to the Nursery. This was a very common social event when a new baby was born. And let's move on now, and we'll conclude this with a study of still life, which, as said, was previously considered at the bottom of the hierarchy of art, but it achieved a new prominence during this time. So a lot of times you see fruits and vegetables and various types of food, oysters here, with very rich fabrics, a lot of transparent glass, reflective objects, really showing the skill of these painters. This is Peter Klaus and his still life with skull and writing quill. And a lot of symbols here about death or memento mori. Of course, the skull is a pretty obvious one. The overturned glasses, the candle without the candle in it, the candlestick. There's kind of a humorous thing here with this glass that's being held up to the ear. And this was supposedly a reference to someone who was known as a gossip and busybody and the way they were listening in on conversations. Rachel Reich was a female still life painter specializing in flowers. She was actually the daughter of a botanist and knew quite a bit about these different flowers. They would have all been painted at separate times because their bloom would have been different, but assembled into this very rich still life. And here's a still life with the watch. So again, timepieces, also symbols about the passage of time, the brevity of life, and beautiful depiction of all these different kinds of metals and glass and reflections. Often glasses were turned on their side to show different angles. Very simple background though. This is by Willem Kalf, a still life with a Ming jar. As I said, these goods that were shown in these still lives were showing the wealth, the sophistication of the owners of these goods, and they really show the global nature. All these things were being shipped from all over the world at this time and ending up in these wealthy Dutch households. Some of these still life painters specialized in banquet still lifes, showing the richest kind of objects and most opulent settings. And I think we had seen that one before. Again, flower still life. You see the tulip here, which of course was really important in the Dutch economy at this time. There's also insects though, and that's a symbol of decay and death. So even these flower still lifes had that moralistic message attached to them. And there's another one with very dark, but with insects, a poppy, and reptiles. This is another vanitas. So you have musical instruments in this one, books that are open, all these sort of goods, these symbols of man's intelligence and knowledge, and how it kind of ends up coming to nothing with death. And there is a skull poking behind the book there. This is a very beautiful, simple still life by Adrian Court. Probably not a lot of other meaning to this. And this one is showing an aspect called trompe l'oeil, or fooling the eye by depicting the fabric sort of pulling aside to see the flowers, including these multicolored tulips, which were the most highly prized. And you see insects in this one as well. And this is the goldfinch, very simple trompe-l'oeil type still life with actual bird in it, the goldfinch, which has some symbolic religious meaning as well. Carol Fabricius was a pupil of Rembrandt's who died quite young. There's something called the Delft thunderclap. It was an explosion of a munitions factory and killed over 100 people in Delft. And unfortunately, Fabricius was one of them. So I'm going to end here and just remind you that a lot of these paintings are visible at the Met. And hopefully it will open again in the near future and you'll get the opportunity to see them in person. It really is a treat. Thank you for your time, and I hope you enjoyed this, and hope to see you soon.